My historian guest writes, and I'm quoting, "Tens of thousands of Irish were enslaved and shipped to the West Indies to labor and to die on sugar plantations. There have been recent studies, including Sean O'Callaghan's To Hell or Barbados, The Ethnic Cleansing of Ireland. Such works have caused near hysterical reaction in academia. Politically correct professors are livid that the topic is even discussed." My guest says, as one of my teaching assistants who was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party said to another one of my teaching assistants 30 years ago now, "There are some facts students just shouldn't know." End of quote. He continues, "It is difficult to determine exactly when the first Irish were shipped to the West Indies, but by the mid-1630s, the trade was well underway. There were the freewheelers who voluntarily sold themselves for a term of indenture, usually 7 years. There are also the redemptioners who were duped into signing contracts of indenture. Once in the New World, they were sold for cash at auctions. Then there were the spiriters who were kidnapped and, like the redemptioners, sold at auctions. Many of these kidnapped were children, some as young as 8. One agent bragged he kidnapped and sold an average of 500 children a year throughout the 1630s. Another agent said he also averaged hundreds of children annually and 1 year sold 850. The death toll for Africans shipped to the New World was high. So too was the death toll for the Irish. A loss of 20% during the voyage was continued normal, a percentage of deaths equal to that suffered by Africans in the infamous Middle Passage. Typical was a ship-carrying planter, Thomas Rouse, and his 350 indentured servants, end of quote. My guest is a PhD historian who has appeared in over 100 documentaries, dozens of episodes of the long-running series, The Real West, biography, Tales of the Gun, Wild West Tech, and Outlaws and Cowboys. He taught history for 15 years at UCLA. Please welcome Professor Roger McGrath. Roger, as always, thank you for coming on. Now, the reason we're doing this is because someone floated me this on the internet. Let me read this to you. This is one of these unsourced, no attribution things you see on the internet. The majority of early slaves to the New World were actually white. From 1641 to 1652, over 500 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000 in one single decade, end of quote. My friend said, "Is this true?" So I forwarded it to you, Roger, and you had written something called White Slaves that appeared in Chronicles, so I thought we would talk about it. Talk to me about what you call white slaves.
Well, in that quote, he's talking about the New World. It really was the British New World. And there on the first slavery for the British were mostly the Sugar Islands of the West Indies. And there on most of those islands in the 1600s, the 17th century, the majority of the slaves or indentured servants there were Irish, not Black Africans. On Montserrat, 70% of the slaves on the sugar plantations were Irish. Almost 70% on Antigua. On Barbados, well over 50%, and on most of those other sugar islands, over 50%. So there, the majority of the slaves in those islands were in fact Irish.
Now, Roger, when you use the word slave, what one conjures up are people who are kidnapped or sold, and they belong to the master for the rest of their lives. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, some yes and some no. In the Africans that brought to the New World were already slaves in Africa. The Irish were not slaves, but they became slaves as a consequence of war. And some of the author of that quote was talking about the era of Cromwell in Ireland. And that's when the Irish population 500,000 were killed. And this is out of a population of about 1.6 million. And 300,000 were shipped to the West Indies as slaves. Now, some of those did actually sign a contract of indenture. Some signed the contract of indenture, they couldn't read it. If people don't understand, the Irish didn't speak, write, or read English. They were Gaelic speakers. And so they were easily duped. Those who actually entered into a contract of indenture, they didn't know what they were signing. However, those were a minority. The bulk of the Irish in the New World were simply kidnapped, rounded up in corrals, branded with the initials of the ship they were to board, and sent to the West Indies, and there put on auction blocks and sold. And this would be down to children as young as 8 years old. And some of the things that went on were just mind-boggling. For example, there were those English planters on those islands who were homosexual, and they had boys as young as 10, 11, and 12 that they bought as playthings. There were English visitors to those islands who noted this practice, and they were appalled by it, not for the suffering of the Irish, but for how it debauched these English planters. They were worried about the English planters and not these Irish boys who were enslaved. And the girls also, as young as 12 and 13, were sold into prostitution. And this is by the thousands. And then there were those Irish girls as teenagers and young Irish women that were used to breed slaves with Black Africans. And this way, there wouldn't be any question. Should English question this idea, were they really indentured servants or slaves or not? Because then their offspring would be the offspring from these Black African fathers. And they would be born into slavery and slaves for life. And so even if the mother claimed some kind of expiration of a period of 7 years or so for indenture, she wouldn't leave her children. So she then became a slave for life. And so we can argue about this, how many were actually true slaves or not. The majority were actually slaves. And how many signed contracts of indenture did they ever live long enough to fulfill that contract of indenture and be freed? Some did, but only a minority.
Larry Elder here. Buy gold and get a free safe to store it in. That's right. On qualifying purchases from Birch Gold Group now through March 31st, they will ship a free safe directly to your door. All you have to do is visit LarryForGold.com to get your free info kit on gold and to claim eligibility for your free safe. Here's the deal. The Fed keeps raising rates because, frankly, it's the only tool they have to keep inflation under control. And it's not working. You cannot spend your way out of inflation. You've seen the impact on the stock market. You've seen the impact on your savings. Hedge inflation by owning gold, whether physical gold and silver in your safe or through an IRA in precious metals, where you can hold real gold and silver in a tax-sheltered retirement account. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of satisfied customers. Visit LarryForGold.com for your free info kit on gold and to claim your eligibility for your free home safe by March 31st on qualifying purchases. Again, visit LarryForGold.com. That's LarryForGold.com. Now regarding the indentured servants, you write this. Those indentured servants who were shipped to the American colonies were the lucky ones. For the most part, they were freed after their term of indenture, usually 4 to 7 years, although a number saw their indentures extended for minor infractions. Many were worked to death long before their term was up. The planters in Virginia, you write, for example, had a vested interest in keeping a black slave healthy and as a result might get 40 years of work out of him. The planter had little similar concern for the Irish, Scot, Welsh, or English servant who would usually be gone at the end of his indenture. Overworked and malnourished, the servant often died young. In his weakened condition, he fell prey to disease, end of quote. Wow.
Yeah, the American colonies, and this was true of the West Indies too. In the West Indies in the 1600s, Irish went for about £5 sterling, where black Africans would go for 20, 30, 40 pounds sterling. They were far more expensive, far more valuable, and therefore more protected than were the Irish. The Irish were simply cheap. I mean, the black African slave, you had to buy them from African tribal leaders, usually not their own tribal leader, but they had been come into captivity through war, and usually in Equatorial West Africa. And so they were then sold and bartered for goods. Well, that was an expensive transaction for the slave trader. And then they had to be transported all the way from Equatorial West Africa up to the North American colonies or the West Indies, a much longer voyage than the transatlantic voyage from Ireland to the North American colonies. So black Africans were far more expensive, far more valuable. And therefore the owner had a real vested interest in keeping them alive so he could have their services for a lifetime of productivity. And the indentured servant, be they Irish, English, or Scot, or Welsh, didn't have that kind of value to those who owned them for their period of indenture.
So Roger, at their peak, how many white Irish slaves were there in America, what we ultimately called America?
Well, the numbers are a little bit difficult, but there were hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Were there still Irish slaves at the time of the beginning of the Civil War?
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm.
But there were, now, by this time, there were still indentured servants. However, it was the United States of America and different laws to regulate and control all of this. But well into the 1700s, the 18th century, the majority of those who worked the plantations in Virginia or elsewhere were whites, mm-hmm. not blacks. In 1700, in Virginia, for example, there were only, in all of Virginia, 6,000 black slaves. Now think about that, 6,000, that was it, mm-hmm. in all of Virginia.
Now regarding the Irish white slaves or indentured servants, when did it stop and why did it stop?
Well, in 1681, in the West Indies, a law was passed prohibiting the breeding of Irish women with black African men. And that was passed because it was cutting into the profits of the slave traders. These plantations were breeding then so many of their own slaves that it was interfering with these profits. And these profits, these slave traders, represented powerful English families. They represented mm-hmm. the royal English families, all those people. And it was cutting into their trade. So that reduced it significantly and increased the acquisition then of black African slaves in the West Indies. And from 1700 on, the number of Irish shipped, because after the great Cromwellian confiscation of Irish lands in the 1650s and the hundreds of thousands being shipped, it dropped off precipitously. But still there were thousands shipped, many of them as, quote, political prisoners, as slaves and indentured servants to the New World. I'd rather call them slaves in the West Indies and indentured servants in the North American colonies, although many times there's only a fine difference.
So Roger, bottom line, we are in an era where we're talking about reparations for African descendants of slavery. When you hear the discussion about reparations, do you ever say to yourself, it should be broadened if we're going to have them to include the Irish?
Well, if you're going to be consistent, you'd make that argument. But I think there's no basis for the argument to begin with. Something that happened generations ago, you would have to go to those people
right.
who actually own the slaves, and they would be the ones to indemnify the person who suffered the harm. It wouldn't be Larry or Roger, an American taxpayer, for somebody we never harmed, had nothing to do with that, and we're supposed to compensate them, the people today, for something they never suffered, and there are many generations removed from that. And then you have to also ask yourself, slavery was everywhere in the world from the beginning of time. So where would you stop with this?
Yeah, I have said, Roger, that reparations is the extraction of money from people who were never slave owners to be given to people who were never slaves. I think the whole thing is ridiculous. But the point is, if you're going to play this game, the net ought to be widened pretty far and wide. And I'm not sure there's enough net to cover all the people who would be deserved something, given the fact that, as you pointed out, slavery has been endemic since the beginning of recorded human history.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to remember, under the laws of all nations, it was legal.
It was legal.
They weren't doing something that was illegal. So now ex post facto law, even if you went after and identified somebody as a slaveholder, of course, now generations removed, but can you apply ex post facto laws in the United States under our Constitution?
So, Roger, are you telling me I'm not going to get $5 million out of you?
Well, Larry, we're going to have to check your DNA, and we have to see what percentage, and we have to check to see if any of your ancestors, because remember, there were thousands of blacks who were slave owners in the United States of America on the eve of the Civil War. We have it in the census data from 1860 census.
Oh, Roger, you're always making things complicated. We're going to have to leave it there. Roger McGrath, historian. Roger, as always, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you, Larry.
By the way, Roger McGrath wanted to point out why indentured servitude among Irish went down in what became America and why black slavery went up. Answer: malaria. He writes this: the big killer in the tidewater regions of the South was malaria, which arrived in the New World from Africa, carried by the mosquito, which came from Africa. Anywhere there were large bodies of standing water and warm temperatures, the mosquito thrived. If it hadn't been for malaria, black slavery might not have developed in the colonies. Blacks had protection, the sickle cell, from the disease, which whites did not. Otherwise, free whites and white indentured servants would have supplied all the labor that was needed. By 1700, 80 years after the first Africans had arrived, there were only some 6,000 black slaves in Virginia, less than 8% of the population. Without malaria and other tropical diseases, it is unlikely that this percentage would have increased. End of quote. Now, I know you love the show, so hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and then scroll down to the bottom and get on our mailing list. That way you'll be able to get all of our videos, because every now and then, from time to time, for reasons that confound us, YouTube has a problem with our videos. To make sure you get them all, get on our mailing list. Also, see that little donate button, hit that, throw a little something in the tip jar. Make sure we continue giving you hard-hitting, candid programming. Finally, Larry with Epoch, E-P-O-C-H, Larry with Epoch.com. I am Larry Elder. This has been the Larry Elder Show for Epoch Times. And I repeat, we've got a country to save. I'll see you next time.